Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in late Heian, Japan, with the Heike Monogatari, compiled by anonymous biwa players and later redacted by the blind monk Kakuichi. The Heike begins by striking you like a bell, the sound of the Jinshoja bells, a reverberation that opens the whole world into impermanence. That sound doesn't moralize. It simply frames everything that follows as transient. Right away, the saga refuses a neat courtroom of heroes and villains, and that refusal is the work's moral grammar. The narrative makes you live inside uncertainty, and because those opening lines set the scene, you encounter warriors whose courage sits beside weariness, leaders whose command produces ruin as surely as triumph, and acts of mercy that come too late. The bell's echo pushes you into a moral field where no single verdict holds steady, and that instability becomes the engine of the story rather than a flaw to be corrected. This absence of moral clarity shows up first in the battlefield intimacies the Heike dwells on, where killing is not a tableau of evil and goodness, but an intimate act that reveals interior collision. Take Kumagai Neazane and the young Tara, Atsumari, who meet at the edge of life in a moment crafted by the tale to expose duty and conscience at the same instant. Kumagai rides into a thunder of fury and finds a youth beside him, a flute in his hand, a beauty that does not belong to the world of helmets and banners. The story lingered over the flute's sound, as if music could hold the pieces of a life together for a breath longer than the combat allows. Kumagai recognizes the boy as Terra nobility, the culture that sat at the center of courtly refinement, but on the plane of battle that refinement becomes a point of vulnerability rather than protection. He kills Atsumari. Then the narrative follows Kumagai into a slow, inward unmaking. The head is taken and bound. It becomes a trophy that weighs like a question. Kumagai's hands complete a command set by loyalty and survival, but his conscience completes the picture by refusing the moral clarity of a simple hero's triumph. The Heike watches him convert the deed into lifelong regret, and the regret becomes part of the historical memory, not to redeem or condemn him, but to show the human cost lodged within an act presented as necessary. Because the tale refuses a single moral axis, it treats victories as events that carry their own elegies. Yoshitsune stands as the clearest instance. His warfare reads like art. The descriptions of his stratagems, the descent of troops down steep slopes, the night assaults that split enemy formations, reveal a military genius who shapes the course of a family war with tactical imagination. Yet the text never allows that genius to remain only genius. His brilliance becomes a political liability, knitted into the fragile texture of clans and court. After his victories, after moments when his name floods with admiration and love, the same acclaim isolates him from the political center. The Heike follows the arc when fame becomes a risk, and it draws out how the architecture of power will, within itself, neutralize any force that threatens its monopoly. Yoshitsune's life shows that a commander can win battles and simultaneously make himself a target of his own side's anxieties. The tale makes his heroism and his vulnerability two sides of the same phenomenon, folding admiration into suspicion until both are difficult to separate. That folding happens again in descriptions of Terra rule, where the clan's ascent repeats a courtly pattern, and by repeating it, recreates the vulnerabilities of the aristocratic world it supplanted. Terra no Kiyomori rises by exploiting both military success and the mechanisms of court life. Marriages to the imperial house, the installation of a child emperor within his circle, the lavish patronage that mimicked aristocratic display. The Heike records how Kiyomori ordered his daughter into the palace, how he placed his children and retainers into ranks that the old aristocracy had long used to administer taste and influence. But the Terra replication of court culture carries internal contradictions. The clan consolidates power quickly and concentrates resources around kin, and in doing so, it narrows its own perspective. The Terra begin to live inside a courtly bubble, not through a long, cultivated patina, but through abrupt elevation. And the narrative shows how sudden centralization makes a ruling group brittle rather than secure. The damage of that brittleness appears in small, almost domestic details the Heike prefers to linger upon. A banquet arranged to display family splendor that turns neighbors into enemies. A provincial governor dismissed for the sake of a Terra nephew. A public office turned into kinship currency. These moments are not background. They map how power changes the social fabric and how intimacy with the throne becomes a conduit for resentment. The tale describes how the court, once a place of ritual and poetry, turns into a machine that awards appointments to relatives who lack the older forms of cultivated competence. And this mismatch breeds both inefficiency and contempt. The Terra's imitation of aristocratic soft power has within it the seeds of a hard decline, an administration that feels like nepotism, and a court life that replaces obligation to the realm with obligation to the clan. The narrative is patient with these textures because it wants you to see how cultural mimicry can collapse a clan from within, not by external conjurings, but by repeating patterns that head toward rot. That repetition, the pattern of rise, luxury, alienation, and fall, the Heike treats as structural rather than accidental. It shows the Terra absorbing the very courtly habits that produced aristocratic decadence in the first place. Over-centralization of decision-making, the collapse of merit into familial favoritism, isolation behind ceremonial walls. When the Terra wielded power on the scale of the court, they did what past elites had done. They confused occupation with fitness, title with right, display with governance. As a result, their resources accumulated in ways that made the clan less able to manage broad responsibilities and more likely to provoke countervailing coalitions. The Heike keeps repeating images of walls closing in, both literal and figurative, until the clan's world becomes a sealed room where the only movements left are the private negotiations of kin. That inward turn creates the conditions for rebellion, not as unpredictable cataclysm, but as outcome already pressed into the political body. The text doesn't stop at the Terra's faults. It quietly shows that the Minamoto, who inherit the field, carry the same grammar of eventual decay inside them. Yoritomo, who consolidates the Minamoto victory and lays the foundations for a military government, is shown as a shrewd manager of power. But the Heike pays attention to the ways he internalizes the Terra's faults. The same tools of centralized command, tight kinship networks, and suspicion of independent rising figures appear within the Minamoto leadership. The narrative attentive to cycles reads the Minamoto ascent through the same logic that described the Terra. Success leads to concentration. Concentration fosters insecurity, and insecurity produces the mechanisms of elimination that remake society. The story describes how Yoritomo sidelines brilliant subordinates, Yoshitsune among them, not because of their mistakes alone, but because their brilliance exposes the fragility of centralized control. The same pattern that elevated the Terra now shapes the Minamoto consolidation. The air that cleans the old order begins to build an order that will reproduce the same cycles of accumulation and fracture. This mirror effect appears most starkly in the Kashigo episode, where Yoshitsune's request for recognition and recompense meets bureaucratic denial. The scene compacts political logic into a human refusal. Yoshitsune returns from campaigns holding heads of enemies, expecting to be welcomed, and finds doors shut. He waits outside like a petitioner, and Yoritomo's cold reply transforms public gratitude into private threat. The Heike reports details that matter: the sealed gate, the words of reproach, the image of a commander whose battlefield heroism translates into a personal hazard within his own camp. The scene carries the sense that the very apparatus that rewards victory will then enclose and measure it. And if the apparatus cannot tolerate autonomous renown, it will convert admirable skill into an accusation. So the book offers not a moral fable about deserved punishment, but a political anatomy of how centers of power neutralize energetic actors so their own survival can be secured. There is moral ambiguity in these political calculations because the story makes them almost procedural. Kiyomori's promotions, Yoritomo's suspicions, the hunts for rival trophies, they all read as techniques of governance, and the Heike refuses to let us shelter behind easy moral judgments. The text preserves the tension between the necessity of order and the human cost required to secure it. Kumagai's conscience and Yoshitsune's brilliance are not anomalies in a world of otherwise clear right and wrong. They're symptoms of a system that produces tragedies as part of its operating logic. The Heike invites you to feel that friction without offering a position that remedies it. By doing so, it deepens the moral ambiguity into a historical force. The scene at Dan no Yura gives the Heike's theology of impermanence its most theatrical expression. And in that spectacle, the story reframes victory as elegy with crystalline brutality. The sea becomes witness and agent. The Terra, carrying the imperial child emperor Antoku on their ships, are rooted and choosing drowning over capture. The clutch of courtiers and sailors is described in detail. Their robes, their laments, the child emperor's disappearance into the waves. The sacred regalia, the mirror and jewel that confer legitimacy, are lost to the sea. The narrative lingers on the color of the water, as if the sea itself had been baptized in the red consequence of power. This is not merely historical drama. It is the Heike making visible the inevitability lodged in triumph. The Terra's final image is not defeat alone, but the conversion of final victory into immediate elegy, and the book treats that conversion as nearly metaphysical, a victory that contains within it the structure of its undoing. In scenes like Dan no Yura, the tale moves the thinking from individual culpability to structural inevitability. The drowning of Antoku is at once a tragic human moment and a symbolic fact. The practices that produced royal favor and the accumulation of privilege also made the Terra incapable of sustaining their hold when the public gravity shifted. The story makes the loss of the regalia a kind of ontological rupture. Without those objects, the source of legitimacy evaporates. But the Heike does not stop at this symbolic meaning. It traces how the social mechanisms that brought the regalia into danger, arrogance, negligence, isolation, already functioned in the clan's earlier behavior. The loss at sea, thus, reads as the moment when a historically repetitive logic finally manifests as catastrophe. Because the Heike understands power in patterns, it frames the Terra's fall as an episode within a recurring cycle, rather than as a unique moral failing. The narrative narrates the cycle: rise by martial prowess, assimilation of courtly privilege, over-centralization under kin networks, provoked rivalries and rebellions, and eventual replacement. The text watches the same structure unfold across generations, and then turns that observation into its central argument. Institutions reproduce their weaknesses. The Terra ascend by utilizing the cultural capital of the court, but in copying the old elite's forms of authority, they also copy its frailties. It's as if victory brings with it a built-in self-portrait that, on closer view, carries the stains that will become the fall. The Heike's voice insists that cycles do not need villainous intention to function. In the scenes describing Kiyomori's festivals, the book pays attention to the human pleasures and habits of those who find themselves in power. It never reduces them to caricatures of greed. Instead, it shows people enjoying hospitality, overseeing construction projects, and arranging marriages. Yet those same ordinary behaviors scale into systemic problems when pursued without restraint. The repetition is structural, a cluster of choices that make sense to a leader in the moment: secure a marriage, promote kin, build a new port, accumulate into a governance style that cannot absorb external shocks. The Heike writes those accumulations into the text, as if to say power makes habits into laws, and laws codify the path toward decay. That insight complicates the notion of moral blame, because the tactic that secures a family's survival can become the tactic that destroys a polity once scale and context change. The Heike's portraits of personal sorrow: Kumagai becoming a monk, mothers weeping for sons lost at sea, retired courtiers lamenting the vanity of their former pursuits, refuse to be moral bullet points. They are the small-scale consequences of systemic choices, and the reader is left to hear the accumulating echoes. The tale dissolves the distinction between singular acts and structural momentum, so that guilt and necessity blurrily coexist. A leader's self-preservation strategy can be historically rational and yet ethically corrosive, and the Heike teaches this by putting the human stories at the center of its political anatomy. If the Terra's path reveals a blueprint of elite decline, the Heike treats the Minamoto recovery as not the end of the story, but the next turn in the cycle. Their triumph contains the mechanisms that will regenerate so-called aristocratic faults within a different frame. After Dan no Yura, Yoritomo establishes military governance that reorders court institutions around the logic of warrior rule. He builds administrative structures, consolidates land control, and recruits followers into new ranks. These moves rationalize control, but in the process, they create new channels for favoritism and centralization. The story pays attention to how the Minamoto's solutions build bureaucracies that will demand their own maintenance and encrustations of power. The Heike's attention to this reproduction is less a political critique than an anthropological interest. It watches power reproduce itself and then become vulnerable to the very dynamics through which it achieved dominance. That reproduction appears in the treatment of individual characters within the newly dominant clan. Yoshitsune again serves as the node where structural dynamics and personal drama intersect. He is both a craftsman of victory and an omen of the new system's insecurity. His tactical creativity threatened Yoritomo because it suggested an alternative center of legitimacy based on charismatic accomplishment rather than entrusted power. The Heike describes Yoritomo's calculations in a tone that is clinical rather than condemnatory, as if to make the reader see political choice as a machine that calibrates risk. The result is that the Minamoto settle into the same rhythm of maintaining order by eliminating potential rivals, thereby reproducing the very pattern that had toppled their predecessors. Thus, the narrative refuses a clean moral comfort. Yoritomo may stabilize the realm, but the cost of stabilization replicates the structural path towards selective elimination and eventual repetition. The book's images press this logic further by showing how ritual, law, and culture rearrange themselves around new centers. Where the old aristocracy spent energy in poetry and ceremony, the new warriors invest in patronage networks and land administration. Yet the Heike shows these domains converging over time. Warriors adopt courtly forms, court nobles adapt to samurai governance, and both sides discover that institutional success needs reproduction and protection. The tale presents this convergence as a process that neutralizes novelty through assimilation, which is why the Heike's mood is never triumphant. Every new arrangement the text details, the appointment of governors, the redistribution of manors, the new legal precedents, comes with the knowledge that those arrangements will be defended and extended, and once defended, they will accumulate the same procedural ossifications that produce decline in their predecessors. That tendency toward assimilation makes the story's moral ambiguity a structural feature, rather than an accident. The Heike wants you to see that heroism does not produce moral clarity any more than victory produces meaning. When Kumagai becomes a monk, or when mothers lament the loss of sons, the narrative does not exempt the victors from feeling. Instead, it treats feeling as the engine through which history recollects itself. The book's attention to remorse, ritual atonement, and the Buddhist framing of impermanence all point toward a culture that cannot escape the institutional momentum of power, even as individuals within it seek personal redemption. The Heike thus positions interior conscience against public machinery, showing them as two overlapping systems that rarely resolve cleanly. Because those systems overlap, the text suggests that every conquest already contains its obituary. A battlefield success becomes a public memory that others will read, contest, and use, and the very renown that motivates followers invites envy and structural countermeasures. The Heike frames this as inevitability. When a clan attains unchallenged prestige, it both secures itself and inscribes the story of its decline in the public record. Victory writes its own elegy. The triumph carries documentary trace that future actors will cite as reason and cause to undo it. In scenes of triumph, the book slips in observations that look like fate because they are the logical consequence of institutional behavior. The moral ambiguity only sharpens this inevitability, since humane conscience cannot arrest the centrifugal forces of power consolidation. The narrative opacity of the Heike, its refusal to pronounce absolute judgments, also affects the way we perceive responsibility. The story disperses blame into practices, rituals, and ordinary decisions. A marriage, a construction project, a promotion. By distributing responsibility, the book makes the fall appear as the product of accumulated human working habits rather than of monstrous will. This distribution is critical because it lets the Heike examine cycles without descending into moral simplism. Each episode, whether intimate like Atsumori's death or public like the sinking at Dan no Yura, reads as a node in a network of decisions. The tale's density comes from that networked reading, and from its willingness to let small actions have historical weight. The Heike's style reinforces this structural reading, by dwelling on repetition and echo. Phrases recur, images mirror each other, and scenes of celebration are set against scenes of mourning. The composer of the narrative intentionally reuses motifs, so the reader begins to notice the pattern as a force that moves history forward. The seasons change, but the human attachments do not. They simply transmute into new forms of privilege and exclusion. That formal repetition mirrors historical repetition, so that the text's very language presses you to understand the fall of the Terra as an instantiation of a recurring rhythm. This rhythm turns our attention away from the question of who was guilty and toward the question of why victory becomes hollow. The Heike insists on the idea that the meaning of victory erodes not because winners are immoral by nature, but because their social architecture transforms triumph into a practice of preservation whose means are incompatible with durable legitimacy. The text shows how rituals created to mark rank become instruments of exclusion, and how the concentration of economic resources into kin networks reduces the state's capacity to respond to crisis. The story's logic is cumulative. Each episode you have read intensifies the sense that structures shape behavior and behavior reshapes structures, and that loop produces the cycles we observe. By the time the narrative has folded Yoshitsune's exile and Kumagai's repentance into its moral net, it has made the point that personal virtue and institutional health do not track each other. A brave commander can make enemies within his own side. A dutiful retainer can become a penitent monk. A ruling clan can be courted by admirers even as it prepares the ground for its undoing. These contradictions are not exceptions in the Heike. They are the rule the text wants you to witness. The tale draws you into the tension and then keeps you there, refusing to resolve the conflict because the unresolvedness is instructive. It shows how cycles operate without moral neatness. That refusal is not an evasion. It is more like a diagnosis. The Heike reads history as a machine that manufactures both power and its obverse. The narrative eyes small events to reveal systemic dynamics. When the book returns to images of bells and waves, it is reminding you that the story's surface events, the battles, the drownings, the promotions, are visible manifestations of deeper structural tendencies. These tendencies make collapse seem not merely possible, but, within the logic of governance and human habit, inevitable. The Heike thus asks you to reorient your moral instinct. Instead of hunting for a single villain, attend to the repeating forms that create vulnerabilities. When the saga closes off single verdicts, it also preserves a haunting moral space where pity and blame move side by side. The Heike asks you to pity soldiers who die in rivers and to watch leaders who miscalculate with the same attention. That equal attention does not seek to flatten responsibility. It seeks to keep the eyes open to the complexity of historical causality. Because the tale is attentive to cycles, it refuses relief. Pity remains incomplete because the systems that create the tragedies continue, and the human voices within the text continue to enact the same choices that led to their suffering. The Heike's final posture leaves you with a stubborn sense. Every time a clan ascends and orders the realm, it also rehearses the steps toward its jeopardy. The story shows that the cultural means of governance, the marriage alliances, the ceremonial displays, the centralized appointments, are neutral techniques that shift valence depending on scale and restraint. They can secure a polity, and, within the same mechanics, create the choke points for its collapse. The narrative's attention to repetition uncovers this neutrality. and it does so with a tone that is human rather than abstract. By following individual lives inside this structural frame, the Heike convinces you that cycles hold because people tend to act in ways that secure short-term stability. And in securing it, they unwittingly set the stage for long-term fragility. Because cycles repeat, the Heike refuses to close the argument about meaning. It sets up a loop where winners will be replaced, and where the systems of replacement will themselves bear the seeds of future replacement. Victory therefore reads as transient, but it also reads as instructive. Each triumph shows its own fragile underside, and each fall teaches the next ascendant how to use similar instruments with inevitable consequences. The book does not offer a remedy. Instead, it makes you attentive to patterns, and in that attentiveness, there is both ethical challenge and historical clarity. The Heike's voice remains patient with human contradiction, insisting that we watch rather than pronounce. And in watching, we begin to see how structural repetition makes history move. In the end, the text insists on a kind of historical modesty. It records the grandeur of palace life and the grit of warfare with equal care. And by doing so, it resists the satisfaction of a single moral closure. The Terra's collapse is not exceptional in the sense of being anomalous. It is a case study in the operation of repetition. The tale keeps returning to the same theme. Every victory already contains its own elegy. Every rule contains in its procedures a long-term threat, and every act done in the name of preservation becomes, within a few turns, an instrument of decay. The Heike leaves that loop exposed and asks you to live inside its echo, to feel the inevitable recurrence without settling it. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.